On a sweltering afternoon in 1964, NASCAR officials arrived at Smokey Yunick's Daytona Beach workshop, expecting the usual. They anticipated routine measurements, inspections, and perhaps a few minor adjustments, a performance check that would confirm the Chevelles and Camaros lined up with the regulations of the day. What they found instead was a revelation. At first glance, the intake manifold sprawled across a stock Chevy's engine bay seemed perfectly ordinary. Polished aluminum gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The bends were smooth, the surfaces clean, every component aligned as if it had been plucked straight from a factory blueprint. To the untrained eye, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. But as Smokey fired the engine, the room trembled with the sound of raw, controlled power. It wasn't a roar. It was a calculated declaration. Every cylinder ignited in perfect rhythm. Every valve, every throttle, every piston seemed to harmonize with an intelligence no human had fully calculated. The horsepower readings shot off the charts. Lap simulations produced numbers that made engineers blink twice. Pit crews leaned forward, whispering among themselves in disbelief, jaws clenched in silent acknowledgement. And yet, in the world of NASCAR regulations, in the strict language of inches, pounds, and cubic inches, every single element of that engine was legal. Smokey Yunick had not merely built a component, he had built an argument, a challenge, a manifesto in metal. While rival teams chased fractional gains through more carburetors, larger displacements, and minor camshaft tweaks, Smokey approached the engine as a puzzle to be solved through physics, observation, and pattern recognition. He studied airflow with an obsessive precision, analyzing turbulence, fuel atomization, and velocity stacks to create a system that breathed with unnatural efficiency. Every curve in the aluminum, every subtle taper, every hidden channel was engineered for domination. This wasn't craftsmanship for beauty. It was warfare in steel and aluminum. The intake manifold didn't just move air, it commanded attention. It inspired envy. It intimidated competitors. And it would eventually induce panic within the very organization that thought it had the sport under control. Inspectors, hardened veterans of NASCAR, attempted to rationalize what they were seeing. "It must be a fluke," muttered one. "It can't perform like that consistently over an entire race." Yet theory collapsed the moment Junior Johnson strapped into the Chevelle. By the second lap of a test run, whispers turned into muttered fears. The intake manifold wasn't merely providing an advantage, it was a weapon. Every throttle application, every gear change, every acceleration out of a turn revealed brilliance, invisible to anyone who lacked both the technical skill and the foresight to understand it. NASCAR had rules, yes, but those rules were written for men who measured and complied, not for a genius who anticipated them 3 steps ahead. Inside the workshop, chaos appeared everywhere. But it was meticulous chaos. Mechanics moved with precision and ritual, executing instructions without fully comprehending the system they were maintaining. Blueprints plastered the walls, scribbled with shorthand, diagrams, and notations that looked like gibberish to outsiders. Tubes, wires, and aluminum sections lay strewn across benches in what seemed like disorganization, but to Smokey, each piece was part of a greater symphony. He stood back, cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes scanning every angle, every reaction from the inspectors, every twitch of a competitor's gaze. He knew the inspectors were already outmatched before they touched a single wrench. His creation wasn't just functional, it was untouchable. Rumors of the Chevelle's mysterious power spread almost immediately. Competitors whispered of engines that seemed to defy logic. Mechanics attempted to replicate the design, taking photographs, analyzing flow, measuring carburetor throat sizes, but every attempt fell short. NASCAR itself was caught between authority and reality. They had the rulebook, they had regulations, they had inspections, but the reality was clear. Intelligence could outpace enforcement, and ingenuity could hide in plain sight. Meetings were convened in Charlotte, Debates raged, and panic quietly settled over the sport. The intake manifold had proven an uncomfortable truth. Compliance could coexist with domination, and brilliance could render authority powerless. Smokey's design was about more than speed. It intimidated, manipulated, and rewrote the psychological rules of racing. While competitors relied on brute force and straightforward mechanics, every Chevelle that left Smokey's garage carried a subtle, silent message. Every lap became a chess match. Every cornering maneuver, every throttle response, every gear shift was carefully orchestrated not just for performance, but to exploit assumptions, to stretch rules to their maximum, to demonstrate that intelligence could outthink regulation at every turn. For Smokey, the intake was more than an engine component. It was a weapon, a statement, a manifesto of mechanical and strategic dominance. As the season unfolded, NASCAR scrambled to respond. Inspections were intensified, regulations revised, airflow restrictions proposed, and every potential loophole investigated. But Smokey had anticipated every contingency. The intake looked ordinary. It complied fully with the letter of the law, yet it shattered the spirit of enforcement. Every attempt to understand or constrain it only highlighted a chilling truth. The Chevelle wasn't just a car. It was a system designed by a mind operating in a different dimension of understanding. It was legal, yet untouchable. Ordinary, yet revolutionary. And it humiliated every official who believed control was absolute. By the end of the season, the Chevelle had not only dominated races, but rewritten the assumptions of NASCAR oversight. Competitors were humiliated, officials shaken, and the public unaware of the invisible war being waged under the hoods of their favorite cars. The intake manifold was more than a piece of aluminum. It was a blueprint for rebellion without lawbreaking, dominance without exposure, and intelligence applied with ruthless precision. It forced NASCAR to confront a reality it was unprepared for, that rules alone could never contain brilliance. Even decades later, engineers, historians, and racers study Smokey's 1964 intake in awe. The component was legal, but it broke the sport. It was subtle, yet undeniable. It wasn't flashy, yet it inspired fear. Smokey Yunick didn't just build an engine, he built a statement, a challenge, and a lasting legacy that proved one man's mind could bend a sport without ever breaking it. This is the story of the intake manifold that shook NASCAR to its core, the Chevelle that no inspector could stop, and the genius of Smokey Yunick, who showed the world that intelligence, cold, calculated, untouchable intelligence, is often the most powerful engine of all. On an afternoon in 1964, NASCAR officials walked into Smokey Yunick's workshop expecting routine. What they found instead was a revelation that would send shockwaves through the sport. The intake manifold sprawled across the engine bay of a stock Chevy seemed innocent at first glance. Clean lines, polished aluminum, nothing overtly aggressive. But the moment Smokey fired the engine, the reality hit. The car roared with a violence and precision no inspector could explain. The numbers didn't lie. Horsepower readings off the charts. Lap times unmatched. Pit crews whispering in disbelief. And yet, by every written rule, this engine was legal. Smokey had built more than an intake. He had built an argument, a challenge, a statement. He didn't just improve airflow, he redefined it. While rival teams chased cubic inches, carburetor tweaks, and marginal tuning, Smokey analyzed patterns, turbulence, fuel atomization, and velocity stacks. Every curve in the intake, every polished contour, was designed not for beauty, but for domination. When the engine breathed, it drew in more than air. It drew attention, envy, and eventually, panic. Inspectors tried to rationalize it. It must be a fluke, one muttered. It can't be sustained over a race. Junior Johnson strapped in, and the car surged down the track. By the second lap, theory collapsed. The intake wasn't just a minor advantage, it was a weapon. Every gear shift, every throttle application revealed the brilliance hidden in plain sight. Smokey had exploited assumptions that no rulebook anticipated. The intake design wasn't a loophole. It was a blind spot in NASCAR's enforcement. The workshop itself told the story of a mind operating on a different plane. Aluminum, steel, and copper tubes were strewn with meticulous chaos. Blueprints marked with shorthand codes covered the walls. Mechanics moved deliberately, following protocols without fully understanding the system. Smokey watched, calm, cigarette dangling, eyes scanning every angle, noting every reaction. He knew the inspectors were outmatched before they even touched a wrench. His creation wasn't just functional, it was untouchable. Rumors spread quickly. Teams whispered of engines that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Mechanics tried to replicate, but each attempt fell short. NASCAR was caught between authority and reality. They had rules, but those rules were written for men who followed instructions, not for someone who anticipated them. Meetings were called in Charlotte. Officials debated, argued, and eventually panicked. The intake had proven that enforcement alone could not contain innovation. Smokey's design worked on multiple fronts. It increased power without enlarging displacement, defied airflow limitations, and integrated seamlessly with the chassis. But more than that, it intimidated. Competitors who once relied on brute force and straightforward mechanics now faced a mental game. Every race was no longer about speed alone. It was a chess match against a man who saw 3 steps ahead, whose engines were not just machines, but psychological weapons. When the inspectors finally understood the implications, it was too late. The intake design had already changed the competitive landscape. NASCAR quietly attempted to clamp down, drafting new restrictions, redefining permissible manifolds, and forcing teams to reconsider every approach. Privately, some officials admitted they had underestimated the man. Publicly, they enforced new rules. But behind closed doors, Smokey's ingenuity was recognized as untouchable. Even today, decades later, engineers and historians look back at 1964 and shake their heads. The intake manifold wasn't just a piece of metal, it was an ideology. It represented rebellion, foresight, and meticulous calculation. It was a blueprint for every outlaw mechanic who would ever dream of bending rules without breaking them. Smokey Yunick had proven that a single design, invisible in plain sight, could destabilize authority, dominate competitors, and leave a permanent mark on history. The morning after the first public tests, the racing world was buzzing. Mechanics and drivers crowded the pits, eyes wide, whispers sharp as razors. "Did you see the airflow on that thing?" one asked. "It's impossible," another muttered, watching the black and gold Chevelle sit quietly, engine ticking like a beast, just contained. Smokey Yunick didn't care about the stares, the muttering, or the suspicion. He was already thinking 3 races ahead, already imagining the tweaks and adjustments that would keep him untouchable. For him, innovation wasn't about speed alone, it was about control. Power without obedience was meaningless. And this intake? It was a masterstroke. Every inch of tubing, every bend in the aluminum, had a purpose so precise it defied casual understanding. The system increased the engine's volumetric efficiency to near mythical levels without violating displacement rules. Rivals tried to replicate it, but they lacked the foresight. They measured carburetors, compared gasket thicknesses, rethought throttle linkages, yet none saw the subtle genius. Smokey's intake manipulated pressure waves inside the manifold, a phenomenon NASCAR inspectors didn't even know to measure. To them, it looked like an engine running hot, strong but not illegal. To Smokey, it was domination hiding in plain sight. NASCAR's inspectors grew frantic. They began tearing down cars at random, measuring, weighing, documenting. Yet every check failed to find the cheat they assumed must exist. Every time they thought they had uncovered an irregularity, it turned out to be compliance, subtlety, or pure mechanical genius. One official later admitted, off the record, that he felt humiliated by a man who had understood the rulebook better than those who wrote it. That sense of being outsmarted spread through Charlotte like wildfire. Smokey wasn't just winning races. He was winning the mental war. Competitors tried intimidation. They barged into garages, peered over shoulders, bribed mechanics, spread rumors. Yet nothing worked. Smokey's team operated like a fortress of secrecy. Mechanics were trained to follow instructions without understanding intent. Every measurement had a hidden meaning, every test a contingency. The intake manifold was just the surface. Beneath it lay a network of modifications, fuel delivery adjustments, timing tweaks, camshaft harmonics, engineered to synchronize with the manifold's airflow. One wrong move, one inexperienced hand, and the whole system would collapse. Smokey ensured it never would. By mid-season, the Chevelle was untouchable. Lap times dropped, pit stops shrank, and the black and gold machine moved through traffic like a predator, unseen yet deadly. The intake wasn't just a part, it was a weapon, and Smokey's competitors were acutely aware. Some drivers admitted privately that they were afraid of the car. "You didn't race against it," one said. "You survived it." The intake gave the engine a surge of power that made drafting irrelevant, corners a tactical advantage, and fuel efficiency a weapon. NASCAR rules could not, and did not, account for this level of ingenuity. The pressure on NASCAR escalated. Internal memos from Charlotte reveal heated debates. Should the car be banned? Should new specifications be drafted mid-season? Officials argued over legality, intent, and fairness. But the reality was clear. The intake was untouchable. They could enforce rules, but they couldn't enforce intelligence. Smokey had built a machine that operated in the gray area of genius, exploiting assumptions, redefining limits, and exposing blind spots in NASCAR's oversight. Behind the scenes, the Chevelle became a legend. Mechanics from rival teams attempted to replicate the design, even hiring specialists to reverse engineer airflow patterns. Photographs were analyzed frame by frame. Flow simulations were attempted on paper and in rudimentary wind tunnels, and yet every attempt failed. The genius wasn't just in the aluminum, it was in the orchestration, the holistic integration with the engine, chassis, and fuel delivery system. Every competitor learned, reluctantly, that they weren't chasing parts, they were chasing the mind of Smokey Yunick. When the Chevelle finally took the green at a major superspeedway, the crowd only saw speed. The engineers and inspectors saw a rulebook shattered. The drivers saw a monster that couldn't be predicted. Smokey sat behind the wheel, calm, every gear change deliberate, every corner a calculated maneuver, and every lap a quiet humiliation for the officials who had believed they could control him. The intake had transformed an ordinary Camaro into an untouchable predator, and with every passing mile, it became clear. NASCAR couldn't stop this car, not without rewriting history. Even today, the 1964 intake remains a study in audacity. It wasn't illegal, yet it broke the sport. It wasn't loud, yet it commanded attention. It wasn't flashy, yet it inspired fear. Smokey had built more than an engine component he had built, a statement. Intelligence could dominate power, and foresight could rewrite rules without lifting a single hand against them. The moment the Chevelle rolled into the superspeedway pits, the atmosphere changed. Mechanics and NASCAR inspectors, hardened veterans of the sport, froze as if confronted by a ghost. They had seen fast cars before. They had seen dominant cars, but nothing had prepared them for this. Every component of Smokey Yunick's intake screamed precision, whispered defiance, and mocked their authority. It wasn't just an engine part, it was a scalpel cutting through the assumptions they had built their careers on. Smokey's competitors were furious, frustrated, and increasingly desperate. Engines were torn apart in garages across the Southeast. Mechanics spent sleepless nights testing airflow and fuel curves, hoping for a flaw, a clue, a weakness they could exploit. Yet every calculation failed, every measurement misled. Those who worked closest to NASCAR admitted privately that they felt embarrassed, outclassed by a man whose mind operated at a level no regulation could ever reach. And yet, the public never saw it. To fans, it was just another Chevrolet Camaro ripping laps off the track. To insiders, it was a quiet humiliation, a constant reminder that brilliance could not be policed. NASCAR's response escalated. They sent top engineers and inspectors to every race Smokey entered. Teardowns, flow tests, and visual inspections became ritualized. Yet Smokey anticipated every move, every bend in the manifold, every valve setting, every airflow divergence had been calculated, not just to optimize horsepower, but to mislead the untrained eye. The intake manifold seemed ordinary. It met the letter of the law, but its true function, shattering assumptions, remained invisible. And each time NASCAR thought they had gained the upper hand, the Chevelle proved them wrong, lapping slower competitors effortlessly, while officials scurried to interpret their own rules. The Chevelle didn't just win races, it terrorized reputations. Drivers who had once held championships now spoke in hushed tones, admitting that they couldn't compete with a car they didn't understand. Crew chiefs whispered about sabotage, bribery, and secrets. Some even suspected corporate interference from rival manufacturers, convinced that Smokey's genius must have come at the cost of some moral compromise. But in truth, it was just the mind of a man who refused to accept limitations. Every turn of the wheel, every roar of the engine, every lap completed under full power was a calculated insult to anyone who believed authority could dominate ingenuity. Inspections became a theater of tension. NASCAR officials arrived early, clipboards in hand, ready to catch Smokey cheating. Cameras clicked, measurements were taken, flow rates calculated, pressure tested. Yet each inspection ended in confusion, frustration, and quiet admiration. The system had been built to trap violators, but Smokey had built a system that couldn't be trapped. Every line of the intake design, every timing adjustment, and every custom fabrication worked in harmony, and every inspection only reinforced that Smokey had foreseen every potential loophole. The political ramifications were immediate. Internal memos from Charlotte reveal anger, panic, and disbelief. "How does one man consistently outthink the body of rules we enforce?" asked one official. Another wrote that the Chevelle operated in a domain we do not comprehend. And behind the scenes, whispers began circulating about rewriting engine specifications, mandating inspections before every race, and imposing limits on airflow designs that had never existed before. Smokey's intake had exposed a weakness that NASCAR couldn't fix: intelligence. The system was only as strong as the assumptions it relied on, and Smokey Yunick had obliterated them all. Rival manufacturers grew desperate. Ford, Pontiac, and Chrysler teams sent spies, bribed mechanics, and even experimented with illegal modifications in a frantic attempt to replicate the effect. Rumors of secret workshops and clandestine airflow tests spread through the racing community. Yet nothing worked. The intake manifold remained untouchable. The brilliance wasn't in the aluminum, the carburetors, or even the throttle linkage. It was in the orchestration of every component, in a synergy of engineering, timing, and foresight that no one else could replicate. And then, in a move that would become legend, Smokey allowed journalists a rare glimpse under the hood. They saw tubing, manifolds, and a seemingly conventional engine. But what they didn't see, what NASCAR didn't see until it was too late, was the orchestration beneath pressure waves timed perfectly, airflow harmonics, fuel delivery optimized in ways that existed only in the mind of one man. Photographs captured parts, measurements documented surfaces. Yet the genius remained untouchable, invisible to anyone who lacked the combination of insight, experience, and audacity to comprehend it. By the end of the 1964 season, the Chevelle had dominated. Wins piled up, lap records fell. Officials were forced to acknowledge the truth privately. This intake had broken the sport's assumptions. They had attempted every inspection, every measurement, every regulation tweak, and failed. The car wasn't cheating, it was outthinking them. And in that realization, NASCAR understood something deeply uncomfortable. Rules could never fully contain genius. Authority could never fully enforce understanding. Smokey Yunick had done more than build a car, he had rewritten the invisible laws of racing. The Chevelle, its banned intake, hidden yet undeniable, became a symbol of audacity, strategy, and rebellion. Every competitor, every official, and every fan who witnessed it understood, on some level, that they were seeing something forbidden, something untouchable. It wasn't just an engine part. It was an ideology, a philosophy, a challenge. Intelligence could dominate power. Subtlety could defeat brute force. And one man's vision could redefine a sport built on rules. By the spring of 1965, NASCAR was in open crisis. The Chevelle was no longer a single anomaly, it was a statement. Every race it entered, every lap it completed, amplified the fear that Smokey Yunick had uncovered a loophole too dangerous to ignore. Internal memos, later revealed in private archives, spoke of engineering beyond comprehension and a threat to competitive integrity. Inspectors argued, debated, and then demanded rule changes, emergency revisions that would have never been considered if Smokey had not forced their hand. Smokey, however, remained calm in the eye of the storm. While officials scrambled, he continued to perfect the intake. Each minor adjustment, slight tweaks in manifold angle, subtle realignments of airflow channels, enhanced performance, just enough to stay ahead of regulation. Every time NASCAR issued a new interpretation of the rules, Smokey adapted instantly. "They think they're chasing a cheater," a close associate later admitted. "They don't realize he's never breaking the law. He's rewriting it in plain sight." Rival teams, already humiliated by the Chevelle's dominance, resorted to desperate measures. Late-night stakeouts, covert inspections, and even attempts to bribe members of Smokey's crew became rumors whispered in garages across the Southeast. Ford and Pontiac engineers dissected every photograph, every diagram, every hint of tubing they could find, but the true design remained invisible. What NASCAR saw as a conventional intake manifold was only the tip of the iceberg. The genius lay in the harmonization of fuel delivery, air timing, and throttle responsiveness, an orchestra that only Smokey could conduct. At the 1965 Daytona 500, the drama reached its apex. NASCAR inspectors arrived hours early, intent on dismantling the Chevelle and proving once and for all that it violated the rules. Crew members watched nervously, fearing confrontation, legal action, or scandal. But Smokey's work was flawless. The car passed every superficial inspection. The intake looked ordinary. Pressure tests, visual checks, flow measurements, all came back clean. And yet, when Junior Johnson eased the car onto the track, it tore through the competition with an authority that left engines smoking, tires squealing, and officials shaking their heads. Every turn, every burst of speed, every lap screamed defiance. The backlash was immediate. NASCAR's engineering committee convened emergency sessions. New rules were drafted, inspections rewritten, intake specifications clarified, and airflow restrictions proposed. Some officials privately argued that Smokey's work should be outlawed retroactively, but legally, nothing could stick. Every adjustment he had made was within the letter of the law. NASCAR had no precedent for punishing someone who used the rules to outthink them. And in the paddock, stories of the Chevelle's audacity spread like wildfire, earning Smokey the kind of legendary status most mechanics can only dream of. The impact extended beyond the track. Automotive manufacturers began questioning the enforceability of NASCAR rules, realizing that innovation could not be legislated out of existence. Engineers in private workshops dissected old Chevelles and Camaros, trying to replicate the genius that had eluded them for a season. Magazine articles speculated about the forbidden intake, hinting at sabotage, espionage, and secret engineering, while enthusiasts debated if anyone would ever see its equal. Smokey's Chevelle had transcended competition. It had become a symbol of intellectual dominance in a world built on speed and horsepower. Even decades later, the truth remained uncomfortable for the sport. The intake was never banned in a traditional sense. It was simply made impossible to replicate through regulations and oversight. Those who worked alongside Smokey recalled the tension in the garages, the subtle smirks, the quiet confidence that he could and would stay one step ahead. Every inspection, every new rule, every committee meeting confirmed a chilling realization. Ingenuity, when paired with understanding of the system, could always outpace authority. Smokey Yunick's band intake design was more than a mechanical marvel. It was a masterclass in rebellion, foresight, and audacity. It forced NASCAR to confront the uncomfortable truth that brilliance cannot be policed, that rules are only as strong as those enforcing them, and that one man could bend an entire sport to his vision without technically breaking a single law. The Chevelle's legacy lived on, whispered in garages, analyzed in private engineering labs, and immortalized in the lore of stock car racing. And still, when fans ask what truly made Smokey's Chevelle unstoppable, the answer is unsettling. It wasn't horsepower, it wasn't size, and it wasn't luck. It was intelligence, cold, precise, and untouchable intelligence that no sanctioning body could ever fully contain. If you care about the real history, subscribe.